Excellent. Well, thank you all for coming. I think I'm supposed to remind you to sort of turn off your mobile phones and possibly at the end, like, fill out your speaker evaluation forms, though. I might wait and see how things go before I tell you to do that. All right, excellent. Good. Okay. So it's great to see all of you here. So my talk is actually meant to be complementary to CJ's talk, The Lives of Others, which is tomorrow at 1:20 p.m. in room 3016 West Hall. So go see that as well. I mean, you're already here, so I don't need to tell you to come to mine. If this is a topic that interests you, it's going to be a really great talk. So CJ will be telling you all about how to use NPCs to increase player empathy, whereas I'm going to spend the next 20 or so minutes trying to convince you to limit, hurt, stymie, and stifle your protagonist to give your NPCs room to breathe. Actually, my talk title is a complete lie. We're going to do the opposite of forgetting protagonists. I'm actually going to try and convince you to make them pay because they've had it their way for too long. And many times at the expense of other characters. So it might seem a little bit strange that I'm up here talking about writing NPCs with agency when the game that I write that you're probably most familiar with is Inkle Studios' 80 Days, which is a massively branching, anti-colonial, steampunk, choose-your-own-adventure story based on Jules Verne's adventure novel Around the World in 80 Days, which is kind of fundamentally around two whitish Europeans going around the world on a silly bet, encountering people, cultures, and politics in fleeting glimpses. So the setup of our story, of Verne's story really, and the mechanics really almost lend itself to shallow characterization and the playing out of protagonist power fantasies. It would have been very easy for us to make a game which just retold The Last Samurai over and over. Just a chewed over story of a white dude coming into a native culture and just saving the day. But this is exactly the story that we don't want to tell. So we develop strategies to give our NPCs life, agency, integrity, and to balance that with the demands of telling this particular kind of story. And today I'm going to try and share with you some of our design thinking and our strategies with you in the hope that you find it useful. Basically, if we could make a game full of engaging and diverse NPCs with agency, given the original novel could have been easily adapted to be a tourism simulator, you can probably do the same with whatever limitations you're working with, or at least that's the idea. So we have, I think, personally spent too much time fridging girlfriends and little brothers because we're afraid of hurting protagonists. We only kind of dare hurt them by proxy. We think players will be turned off by experiencing a protagonist's loss, or confusion, or stupidity, or failure. Who wants to play a loser? But that's something that seems true, but actually I don't think it is. In fact, I think it's winning all the time that seems fake. True immersiveness necessitates loss, failure, pain, and frustration. Because do you remember that bit in The Matrix when Agent Smith tells Neo about the very first Matrix that's, incredibly perfect, this world without suffering where everyone was happy? It's one of my favorite bits in the film because obviously a simulation of perfection is bound to fail. Everyone rejected it. They lost entire crops, I think is the line. So the thing is, the simulation of perfection is bound to fail, and we're obviously going to keep trying to wake up from it. But it also fails because I think immersion is social. We want to play with other people. We want to engage with people who feel real, and real people demand things of us. Being the specialist snowflake is a lonely fantasy. There is a reason that the Truman Show, I'm dating myself with these references, aren't I? Damn. There is a reason that The Truman Show is about a guy realizing that his surroundings and relationships aren't real and trying to escape rather than to jack further in. Everything in The Truman Show is all about Truman, but eventually that starts to feel shallow and unsatisfying. He doesn't want the simple, transactional, easy relationship with his actor wife, Laura Linney. He wants the thrill and unexpectedness and the risk of Natasha McElhone. And of course he does. So why do games keep trying to give players Laura Linneys with perfect hair and saccharine smiles, when what we clearly want is Natasha McElhone and her crappy apartment and her deflating blowout? Truman deserves someone real and messy, and so do we. But the thing is, games protagonists aren't Truman, who wants to wake up from the self-absorbed dream. They're Gregory House from season 1 of House. They're the obnoxious jerk who gets away with their behavior because they can somehow solve all the problems. Basically the fictional equivalent of that one rude guest at the dinner party that never shuts up. The thing is, everything orbits around House. Everyone else is swallowed up in the supernova of his ego and the totality of his brilliance. And it's a great TV show, but what if all TV shows were like that? Oh, crap. Sorry, Asshole Genius is clearly a popular fantasy. But jokes aside, when it comes to television, it's so easy to understand how limiting it would be to the kinds of stories that we could tell, to the kinds of characters and ideas and themes that we could explore if every TV protagonist, literally everyone, was like House. And if House was our only model for what a TV protagonist was. So the thing is, we have to, if we see how limiting it is with TV, then surely it's as limiting with games. And we have to stop letting games protagonists get away with this. This kind of structural centrality, these assumptions about what it means to be a games protagonist and have agency can lead us to unwittingly reinforce unhelpful cultural and social norms, to keep making the same game protagonist over and over again. Because we're mistaking variations on a theme for variety. We need to start thinking about agency, player agency, as an effect and a technique within a wider context. Agency isn't necessarily a goal in of itself, and it shouldn't be treated like that. So let's talk a little bit specifically about 80 Days protagonist Passepartout and how we approached his place in the game world. So in 80 Days, Passepartout's perceived whiteness and masculinity and Frenchness never go unremarked. We don't treat them as though they're normal or automatically powerful. And in fact, we mark bits of the map as off limits because of them. We have NPCs deny you, as Passepartout, authority and question Passepartout's motives because of it. Whiteness and masculinity make you an outsider in 80 Days, even more often than it allows you within the circle. We remind players of Passepartout's social and cultural limitations in his context. NPCs will often discuss their plans and goals and ideas with Passepartout, but we very rarely allow Passepartout to make a choice for them. He gets involved in revolutions, riots, plots, and NPCs' adventures, but he doesn't drive them. Yes, he can meet a beautiful revolutionary and shout alongside him in protest against a despot, but he can't lead the revolution because he wasn't the one oppressed in the first place. And because the revolution was already happening without him. The thing is, he can't do the liberating because he wasn't the one oppressed, because often the issues our NPCs struggle with are political and systemic, far beyond the ability of one person, even a game's protagonist, to solve. So what that boils down to is that Passepartout, in a traditional choose-your-own-adventure sense, actually goes around the world doing very little at all. We limit his actions and his power, but not the player's agency. So, okay, let's define player agency very loosely as the ability to interact meaningfully with the game world. But let's qualify that a little bit more. If it's about making, say, significant changes to the game world, the words that we need to be looking at here are meaningful and significant, I think. So look at your friendships in the real world. You can probably remember a time when a friend of yours was going through something, a breakup, trouble at work or at home, and they told you about it. You listened to them. You might have even offered them an opinion. They might have done what you suggested, but they might not have. That doesn't really matter. You're still part of that story. Your relationship isn't based on the other person following your directives exactly, or on you making a decision for them, unless you have some incredibly unhealthy friendships. But so the thing is, the meaning, the significance of it comes from the conversations you've had, the connection you share, the relationship itself, the fact that you care about their problem. You may have made a significant change in their life simply by listening. So this is something that I want to talk about more, that player agency doesn't have to translate into action in a traditional sense. Even if a player can't directly affect something, if they can have an opinion or an emotional response or a reaction, for a game to allow them the space to have an opinion can be as powerful as allowing them to do something. And giving protagonists this type of agency actually can allow NPCs then to have more development and depth, to pursue their goals without being constantly overridden and overwritten by the protagonist's overdeveloped sense of importance. Day one of GDC and I'm losing my voice. All right, so let's look at an example of this from BioWare's Dragon Age 2. So how many of you here have played this game? All right, excellent, great. This is going to be good. So the thing is, Dragon Age 2 gets a bit unfairly maligned, I think. Dragon Age 2 is I think it's actually probably my favorite BioWare game, possibly one of my favorite games of all time. And all of that is down to the NPCs. I can still load up any one of my 30 or so saves and feel right at home, not because I remember exactly where I am in the main plot, but because I know exactly where I am based on the characters around me and my relationships with them. Those relationships pull me into the world, and they feel real, the characters, and in Dragon Age 2 feel real in a way that most NPCs in games don't. And that's because they often act independently. And sometimes they lie, which almost never happens in a game. So, spoilers, but in Act 2 of Dragon Age 2, you, the player, find out that Isabella has been lying to you for almost all the way through the game. So, no matter what the state of your relationship with her, how friendly you are, or whether you're in a romance with her or not, she betrays and abandons you because she has pressures acting upon her that you didn't really know about. So it's entirely possible for Isabella to leave the party permanently, leaving your companion quest hanging indefinitely, denying you, the player, and you, the protagonist, any resolution to her action beyond rage or belated justification. And even if she does return to you, you have to deal with the consequences of her betrayal, her independent action. You can't control what she does. And the only thing that you can control here is how you react to it and how you feel about it. And that's really powerful. I think we need more NPCs like Isabella if games are ever going to be more than entitlement simulators. So Matt Bock talked about this at his GDC Microtalk last year, and this is just such a great term for, I don't know what most games can, often feel like. He talks about how the stories, the characters, and the mechanics of games, video games especially, are often designed to give us exactly what we want, uncritically. And this is a problem because whoever heard of that great novel where the protagonist got exactly what they wanted all of the time? Yeah, that sounds like a real page-turner. So looking at games in this way as entitlement simulators also highlights what's wrong about most romances in games, why they feel transactional and goal-oriented. How can we believe in NPCs' romantic desire if they don't have any other kinds of desires? If they feel like skill checks rather than people? We need to give NPCs agency and integrity if romances in games are ever going to feel like more than just playing with ourselves, as it were. So let's keep talking about Dragon Age. Pretty much every single one of the romantic options in Dragon Age 2 stymies the protagonist in some way, which I love. I'm going to talk about the most dramatic example of this, and it only just happens to be my own champion's romantic partner, Anders. Anders is a mage possessed by the spirit of justice who occasionally gets all glowy-eyed and kills people. He is not Fenris, a runaway slave with tattoos, which occasionally get glowy and they kill people. So, just to make it clear. All right, so Anders, whether he's in a relationship with you or not, Anders actually chooses his political ideals over his personal loyalties and commits an act of terrorism that starts a war, which actually goes on to play out in Dragon Age Inquisition. So it's a really, really great moment in the game. You sort of start suspecting that he's like sneaking around and lying, and instead of finding out that he's having an affair and cheating on you, he turns out to have been plotting a terrorist atrocity. What I love about this is that there is no way to stop him or to convince him out of it or even find out what he's planning, no matter how many times you shag, or even if you move him into your fancy mansion in Hightown. And if you're romancing him, the other characters give you, the protagonist, a hard time about the fact that your boyfriend's a secret terrorist. Which is kind of fair enough, right? His actions reflect on you because you chose to romance him. Usually the game protagonist's actions ripple out into the world, and the entire game is about seeing the consequences of your choices, the protagonist's choices play out. But in this instance, you're the one stuck having to cope with and deal with the consequences of an NPC's actions. What this does is begin to move us away from that kind of goal-oriented conception of romance, where you win a romance by getting a character to sleep with you. But in Dragon Age 2, shacking up isn't the end of your story, it's the beginning. It sounds really out there, I know, but the game actually gives you content and dialogue and quests with a character even after you've slept with them. Almost as if one shag doesn't tell you everything you need to know about a person in perpetuity. I guess if these romances have a win state, it's staying together. Anders acts contrary to the interests and goals of the protagonist, and the experience of the game is made richer for it. I personally think that Dragon Age 2 is a milestone for the treatment of relationships and NPCs in games. So giving NPCs control and limiting control and power can create interesting effects and experiences in games, even beyond romantic fulfillment. So I wrote a couple of guest islands for Fail Better Games, wonderful game, Sunless Sea. Any of you played it here? Yeah, well, okay, most of you, that's great. So if for those of you who haven't, it's a texty, literary game of darkness and exploration set in a vast subterranean underworld. I'm deliberately trying to not look at Alexis Kennedy as I say this. I wrote a place called the Isle of Cats, which is a kind of smuggler's haven, a really morally dubious place, a dangerous place. You have to pick a patron on the island and then perform a series of quests to progress. And at one point, one of the patrons, Zaira, demands that you sacrifice a member of your crew to her to allow their memories to be harvested in this incredibly gruesome and horrible way. It's worse than murder somehow, and there is no way to access the rest of the content on this island without giving Zaira what she wants. There is a real cost to the protagonist, but to the player as well. You can retain your in-game morals, but you'll have to give up on the story and the rewards that would result in completing the quest. The protagonist really doesn't get to have everything. And certainly not for free. And that's the entire point. That's how we establish the creepiness and drive home the danger. But the thing is, the player isn't entitled to the end of this story. And even though there's no way to subvert or trick Zaira, the player is not left without a choice. There is a choice, and it's not to play. So Papers, Please is a really interesting counterexample that helps make clear, I think, the distinction between agency and control, between agency and power. So in Papers, Please, you have all the agency in the world to decide how to spend your time, what documents to pass, how to spend your money, but your power is hugely and pointedly limited. Part of that limitation is by making the NPCs in the game demand things of you, demand and need more things than you can provide, forcing you to make choices and compromise and fail. Giving you the agency actually highlights how powerless you are in this world. In playing, you actually form a kind of kinship with the NPCs that you nominally dictate to. You are all, in fact, powerless in the face of Aristotle's tyrannical bureaucracy. So all of these examples, I think, show us ways that NPCs can help make games that go beyond the power fantasy, basically. So in fact, the way in which we treat our NPCs in 80 Days ties entirely into the theme, but it's also a huge part of how our players interact with and understand the world. In a very real way, NPCs are a key part of our world building. We explore wider political, social, and cultural themes through personal concerns and entanglements. The world feels complex because the way our NPCs think about, react to, and engage with the world is complex, and often contradictory. So this feels like a much more elegant and natural way to unfold things like backstory and politics and plot. So in 80 Days, almost every single NPC has a slightly different opinion of the Artificers Guild. So they have their own entirely biased and personal and particular perspective, and that's what the player experiences. World building through NPCs in this way actually makes the world kind of counterintuitively, I think, feel more coherent and alive by, even more so than offering the player a journal entry or a singular definitive perspective. It kind of gives the player the space to make up their own mind, rather than having their mind made up for them. There is no definitive truth about the artificers in a world-building document somewhere. We developed our ideas about the Artificers Guild through writing the NPCs' opinions and our engagements with them. That's what makes the fantasy feel nuanced and grounded. So I'm going to drink some water. So the reason that this works, though, also in 80 Days is because there are so many NPCs in 80 Days and so many perspectives. So no NPC has to bear the weight of entirely representing a culture or gender or a race, which is kind of the quickest way to end up with stereotypes and mouthpieces or merely vessels for plot and story, which is entirely what we don't want. So the way around, one of the easiest ways to avoid this is by doing the research. And I know this doesn't really sound particularly sexy, but it really is, trust me. So beyond just having more characters and not just tokens, you need to do this research. Whether it's about whether your game is about a historical period or a situation or a particular identity, look for real-world examples or dilemmas of dilemmas or people or places or cultures to help inform and add nuance and add nuance to your portrayal of your NPCs. Don't give your NPC the most obvious opinion you think they would have. In some cases, you might need to do research to discover this stereotype that you need to avoid. Do this. It will be worth it. This is the very first hurdle, so don't fall at this one. It's lazy and it's boring and it's so easy to avoid, I promise you. So part of doing the research is also, as writers and creators, asking ourselves whether this is our story to tell. In 80 Days, some NPC stories are simply not for Passepartout. They're not for the player. They're not for strangers, tourists, or outsiders, and that's okay. That can actually be a good thing. This is a question we should ask ourselves when we're writing games and designing NPCs. How much of this is for the player? How much of this is for the protagonist? If we want to breathe life into our NPCs, I think there kind of has to be something left over for them, something that is just for them and not just in service of player, protagonist, or plot. And that might mean telling the story in a slightly different way than you imagined. So there are multiple times in 80 Days where Passepartout encounters a person or a situation and can't do anything to influence them, because of a particular set of circumstances. So it's been really interesting for us to watch players respond to that in forums and blogs. I think it tells us quite a lot about player expectation and how hard we have to work to subvert that to make worthwhile NPCs. So in Brisbane, in 80 Days, you encounter a girl from the indigenous Murri tribe, and she's working as a maid in the hotel that you're staying at. You can engage her in conversation, and she tells you about the depredations her people have suffered as a result of colonialization. And she's written a letter of complaint outlining this, which she wants to get printed in the local newspaper to gain attention for her cause. And you, as Passepartout, as a protagonist, realize that it's unlikely that the white settler-owned newspaper is going to print any such note, especially not on the request of an Aboriginal girl. So you can offer to take the letter to the newspaper yourself, to use your whiteness and maleness and your protagonism, basically, to help her. But she refuses. She doesn't trust you because of all these things, because you're an outsider, because you're white and you're male. You're closer to the oppressor than you are to her. And all the good intentions in the world can't change that. And what is wonderful and perfectly understandable is that there is a heated debate in various forums about how to get the Murri girl to trust you with her letter. This is not surprising. Games train you, the protagonist, to fix problems. Or rather, they teach you that all problems can be fixed by protagonists if you try hard enough. But here, in this case, it's not your problem and you can't fix it. Solving it using your protagonist's white privilege, actually, would make the solution part of the problem. Passepartout can't ride to her rescue. He can't really solve racism by posting a single letter. And your protagonist can't get past years of ingrained distrust of whiteness and his ignorance of local culture and politics in the course of one conversation. She's never going to open up to Passepartout no matter what item you, the player, try and use from your travels. But awesomely enough, when I checked back this thread on the wiki, someone had actually made this post, which is great. Maybe it's a life lesson. Sometimes no matter what you do to try and help, bad things will happen. Exactly, anonymous Wikia contributor. This is not a bug. This is not a bug. This is a feature. This is the entire point of the game. But it is such an unfamiliar notion, I think, to people who play games. And it's such an unfamiliar structure that inhabiting the skin of the protagonist can be limiting as well as liberating. That you will meet someone that does not immediately want to open up to you, the protagonist, and want your involvement. It feels unfair to the player to be shown a problem and not allowed to fix it. But it's important. We couldn't have done it any other way without completely undermining the kind of story that we wanted to tell. We had to deny the player that fairness fantasy, their white savior fantasy. We deliberately steal power from Passepartout and give it to the NPCs, and that's why the game works as it does. Because the way in which we understand and assign agency is not a neutral design decision, as though there's any such thing. And how could we write stories of indigenous power and ingenuity with our words if Passepartout was mechanically solving all of our NPCs' problems for them? It might feel unfair to the player, but maybe unfair isn't the worst thing a game can be. This is one of the myths of equality and multiculturalism and feminism that I particularly despise, that socially good and progressive outcomes are going to come without a cost. But you can't deny this truth in game design. If you want someone who is silent to speak, someone else might have to shut up for a while. With 80 Days, we went in wanting to be respectful to other cultures and people and characters, and that meant that we had to balance the agency in the game as we would difficulty and challenge. This was not only a question of design or storytelling or mechanics, but a question of ethics. So giving NPCs agency can genuinely be an ethical imperative. So specifically, one of our stated purposes was to make a game which undermined the power fantasy. The fantasy of white history and the fantasy of imperialism. And the imperial fantasy requires that the struggles of colonized people, of people of color, of women and working class people and minorities are either ignored or enshrined in in pornographic narratives of victimhood. and suffering. And victimhood is all-encompassing. Victims exist to be saved or pitied, but never respected. Victims are acted upon rather than acting. In fact, victims are the quintessential NPCs. And if we don't deliberately and specifically work to undermine that, all of our NPCs are going to be victims, even if we don't intend them to be. Just as we need to deliberately and specifically work to make sure that protagonist is not synonymous with hero, we need to do this for NPCs as well. And the more that we make these distinctions, the more we interrogate these assumptions, the more we'll be able to shift focus to NPCs, to allow them power and space and depth and importance. And I think this is vital to the progress of games narrative as a craft and to video games as a medium. We need to come to an almost entirely new understanding of the meaning of protagonism and agency, and to find a definition of agency that can assimilate a loss of control, of protagonism that works outside of primacy, of games that can function outside of entitlement. And that's my talk, so thank you very much. Well.